welcome to Assumptions. This is the podcast where two friends, a Christian and an atheist, try to understand the other's worldview. My name is Kyle, I'm the atheist.
And my name is Daniel, and I'm the Christian.
Daniel, this is going to be our kind of weird episode of the season because we're actually breaking away from the format that we established in our first two episodes. Last episode specifically, we were discussing sex and its relationship both in my worldview and your worldview, and now we're going to slightly talk about something that is akin to sex, but it's sexuality. It's how you define yourself in that way.
Yeah, we mentioned that at the end of the last episode, we talked about, rather than just the purpose of sex, we talked about what is the identity that comes with sex. And one of the things that you had, that we had talked about in that show is that when we were discussing the ideas behind sex, and especially some of the stories that you were talking about with those with variant sexual identities, one of the things that I had said is that it's really important to hear those stories, and that's, I think, a huge part of having this discussion, and I think it's something that Christians haven't done very well of doing it. But we didn't talk much about that story because we were going to save it for this episode.
Right.
Yeah, so this is, us friends of our show know, this is the show where there's a Christian and a bisexual atheist. In fact, when I start typing bisexual, the next word that pops up on my keyboard is atheist. So apparently they're now linked forever in my mind. But you identify as bisexual.
That's right. Actually, and on my phone, it's go-go dancer is actually what is the next one that pops up for me. Yes, I do identify as a bisexual, and specifically that. I know that inside of the broader LGBTQ community that sometimes bisexual and pansexual are interchangeable terms. It really comes down to whatever you're most comfortable with, and I'm just more comfortable with the bisexual label than anything else.
Why is that?
Just probably because I heard it first instead of the other one.
You also hate flutes.
I also hate flutes.
Yeah,
can't stand them. Pan can take it and get out of my face.
I think when Christians hear bisexual, there's a lot of confusion. Do you think that's true of Christians alone, or is that something that you've encountered?
No, I think that's actually true for a lot of different groups. You actually hear it in my story a little bit. I mentioned it very briefly of how I think in both the strictly gay community and in the heterosexual community, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of distrust about bisexuals specifically. Totally. And this has a lot to do with how they're presented in media. The very few true bisexual characters that have been presented are usually villains, and then usually very loose in morals and wishy-washy and that sort of thing.
Yeah, which, I mean, you have that t-shirt, right? I'm loose in morals and wishy-washy, so.
that's right. Hashtag loose in morals.
That's right. Okay, so, every time that I mention to Christian friends of mine about this podcast and mention that you're bisexual, there is a lot of confusion that I hear around that. And
you're like, how does that work?
Yeah, just like, well, so yeah, exactly, and a lot of mistrust. Exactly what you said there. There's mistrust and just a certain sense of, really, like this is, he can choose from both worlds. Like, what does that even mean? And as I've come to know you as a friend, and over time, it wasn't like we met and you're like, hey, I'm Kyle and I'm bisexual, and I was like, hey, I'm Daniel.
It's on my business card though. I give to people,
or your T-shirt.
That's right.
But as I've become friends with you and have listened to your creative projects, there has been snippets of your story, but I don't think I've ever heard the whole thing. And so tell us what we have in store for this episode.
Yeah, I'm just going to basically read off a story that I wrote. I will say straight up, I haven't actually spoken this out loud yet, so I don't know how well this is necessarily going to flow. And this is definitely a very compressed version. I could have gone into much more detail in some of the scenes and some of the stories that I have. So I was trying to be economical with time, but also hit like the high points of things that were in my journey.
Yeah, and because this is a chance for me to listen in depth, hopefully I'll be okay if I ask questions along the way. And
actually, I'm going to read my story first, just by itself.
Sure.
React how you want to, with stunned gasps and standing applause at the very end of it.
Sure.
But yeah, and then we can have a conversation maybe afterwards.
Okay. Excellent. Let's do that.
My story isn't a nicely woven 3-act narrative. I wish it were. It would make for a much more exciting podcast. It wasn't a struggle of identity with an emotional resolution, only a realization and then the dawning knowledge that I could never tell anyone. I was in third grade. I was a tall, geeky kid, which I know is a shock to the people who know me as a tall, geeky adult. But I was walking down the hallway of Lochkern Elementary School. The bell had just rung, and I knew I needed to make my way to gym class. This wasn't terribly great for me, as I much preferred sitting somewhere reading a book than sweating while doing a sport I was not and would never be any good at. And there was something else that was nagging at me. There was something weird about the change room. And no, it wasn't the smell. That couldn't be avoided. It was that while changing, I was starting to notice the other boys' bodies. I could tell that I was becoming attracted to them, and this scared me. I'd heard the hushed whispers of gay while growing up, and I wasn't completely clear on the specifics, but I did know that it was considered wrong, and more than wrong, terrible. What was confusing was that I was also hopelessly pining over Sarah. She was an older woman in grade 4. I thought she was so pretty, but I was confident that she would never want to be seen next to a geek like me. And it wasn't as if I could pursue any of the boys. Not only were most of them still firmly in the phase that they thought dating was how you got cooties, but I was convinced that I was the only aberration. I was broken. God had chosen to inflict on me an awful disease. So I was there in the hallway, and it just clicked that I liked both. In the same way that I enjoy cake and pie, I knew that I liked both girls and guys. It made sense. I understood it, and then I shut up about it. The hidden part of myself greatly affected me. There's no doubt that because I wasn't able to be open about feelings of inferiority, my terrible self-esteem, and suicidal thoughts were intensified. I'm sure that some trashy afternoon TV talk show mentioned bisexuality because by the time I reached middle school, I knew that word. The exploration of my sexuality started off fairly tame. One of the more innocent crushes I had was on JTT. Ooh. For those not familiar with that acronym, it was Jonathan Taylor Thomas. He was only a couple years older than me and co-starred on the family sitcom Home Improvement. He was perfection. Or so my puberty-stricken mind believed. I would linger by the magazine stand when I went with my mother grocery shopping. I would glance around, make sure that nobody was around, and then quickly read the Teen Beat or Tiger magazines to see different pictures of him. I was silently smitten. In grade 7, I had my first sexual interaction in computer class. One of the not-so-great students, Stephen, began talking with me. Being terribly shy at that point in my life, I would respond with 1 or 2 word answers, but he persisted. Things escalated when he would accidentally touch me, first on the arm, then grazing my knee, and soon it turned on to full-on groping. It was exhilarating. I'd never had this much attention paid to me before. Sure, I'd had a few kisses with girls on a date, but this was next level. It was exciting because I knew I wasn't doing something that was right and was getting away with it, which is why I started to steal cars. That's a joke. But there was a moment where Stephen invited me back to his house. He said we could go there for lunch. We could go further, maybe take our clothes off. I was tempted. I know I wouldn't have gone anyway. The thought of walking away from school when that wasn't allowed would have been too much for my goody two-shoes to handle. That decision was made for me, though, when one of the class clowns overheard part of the conversation that we were having and started announcing it to the class. Now, I wasn't necessarily implicated in that. He had only heard Stephen's portion, but I was still scared. I was sitting right next to him. The talking and touching stopped from that day forward. By high school, I'd had enough. My big plan was to buy a bunch of Advil and eat the entire bottle. I'd written my note, I'd bought the pills, and then... Well, that's another story completely, but the compressed version is that a friend saved my life by asking a simple question. I moved out of my small town to go to university. It was in a slightly bigger town. During my second year, there, on the first day back from summer, I met Big Gay Greg. Not his real name. What happened is that thing that happens in college when you live in residence. Everyone goes room to room introducing themselves. He could
Really?
What's that?
Is that a thing?
It is a thing.
Okay.
He could probably tell I was a bit of a closet case and spent the night with me. Nothing happened. We talked for a long time. We ended up in my room. Our hands touched. I knew he wanted me to make a move, but I just couldn't do it. All the years of guilt would not let me break out of my own self-hatred. That year was also my first true relationship with a girl. It only lasted 6 weeks, but I fumbled my way through being a boyfriend. I was 19, and I was terrible at it. I eventually came out to friends. I attended a conference that was all about self-empowerment that many look at as a scam at best and a cult at worst. It was called Landmark Forum. But I phoned up a few friends and officially told them my big secret. None were exactly surprised, and nobody wanted to disown me. I was becoming more secure with myself. Over the years, I've had relationships with both men and women. Some I've told right away, and others I've waited to open up about my sexuality. There is still a stigma about bisexuals in both straight and gay culture. That was hard, but I was figuring things out about myself in a really awkward way. But it was really when I began making YouTube videos regularly in 2010 that I began to truly accept myself. My original videos were very surface level material, but I began to dig deeper and deeper into myself. By revealing parts of myself to friends and complete strangers, I felt liberated and entirely safe in my own skin. I do still sometimes flash back to that hallway. I return to that scared boy who felt that he couldn't tell the truth and be himself. And then the bell rings, and I return to the present, a little relieved and a lot more confident.
Well, thanks for sharing. What was that like to write and to put together?
It was interesting. I was trying to figure out the things to really include because I mean, like I just mentioned before we jumped into that, was I could very much have spent like thousands and thousands of words just on my elementary school experience, and I just felt like, well, this was like the important starting off point, and then these other things were kind of the highlights as we went along with it. There were some things I hadn't thought about for a long time. That realization about that first day back into second year of university, like, man, I hadn't thought about that day for years and years and years. But that was both a scary and kind of an exhilarating moment at the same time when I could tell that somebody was interested and I couldn't reciprocate.
Do you regret not being able to reciprocate?
In a way, I do. I don't think that we would have been a good match. Absolutely not. But I do think I still should have maybe jumped with both feet in just to have that experience. At the same time, we mentioned last episode my experience in a hotel room, which was an awful thing to have happened. So it may have ended up the same way.
That's interesting that you just now have that idea of knowing that you weren't a good match as a relationship, but still kind of longing for that sexual encounter.
Yeah, which is an odd, I think, realization to have. Yeah. And I think I end up with that a lot of the time. There's definitely people in real life that I become attracted to and be like, man, I would love to pursue a romantic relationship, but we'd be awful for each other. Like we just would not be a good match with each other.
And is that something that I mean, because we talked last episode about the idea of sex being designed to bring two people together into a close relationship, but then also being an act of pleasure, and that those two for you can coexist.
Right.
And yet there still is that tension, even as you're describing it right now.
Right.
Of what is it for?
Well, yeah, I mean, I still probably wouldn't pass up the chance for certain people if they did express an interest in me to like have a one night fling or something like that. But my own want and my own future that I envision for myself is something that's more long term. I don't necessarily like having one night stands for forever and ever. I have a question for you though. I mean, you're asking questions to me, but I'm curious what your initial response is, like what your initial thoughts were while listening.
I was hoping that. Well, I think just even hearing the story of the bottle of Advil and the note, I haven't heard that before, and so that's just like, as a friend, that's like, oh my god, that's happened. Can we talk about that for a moment, please?
Let's pause for a second.
Whoa, because one of the things that I've had the impression of as I've known you is that this. You mentioned that how there was abuse a little bit in your childhood, and that there was a lot of emotional damage that took place that you've been trying to work out of. And I've been always wondering how much of that was related to identity when it comes to sexual identity. And it
in what way? In what way?
I don't know. In the sense that how was reconciling yourself with your sexual identity?
Well, I think that's part of it. I think that's also a lot of why there was for a while at least a lot of shame when sex was brought up. That I felt a lot of shame
because of the abuse, or because of
because the abuse I'm talking about, and I really don't want to get into too many specifics with this, but the abuse was not just physical but also sexual at the same time. So I think that really corrupted me a whole lot. I really dislike when people assume that somehow turned me into a bisexual, or that turns people gay by being abused in their youth, because I don't believe that to be true. But I still think that it has a lot to do with it. It's not just my sexual identity, but the fact that this happened in my childhood all together kind of really impacted me.
Totally, yeah. And then that would just create an unstable foundation for exploring it. You talked before about that sense of education, that sense of taboo as being one of your problems with how sex is treated in our society. And so given that context, I think that just makes, because there's not only is it the conceptual side of it, there's the personal side of it.
Which is why, going back to my first true girlfriend in university, I have a lot of shame and regret for that too. Why? Because I wish I could have been a more intuitive and co-partner with that, but we both knew that we liked each other, so we started this relationship. I, of course, 19, so it's a little bit of immaturity there to begin with, but also I just I didn't have the love language, for lack of a better word. I didn't have really the basis there, the bedrock to really be in a functioning relationship in the proper way. And so I think both of us left kind of hurt in that relationship, because I just was not physically or emotionally able to be there for her in any real way. So I feel bad about that a lot.
That's something I will look forward to talking more about in our dating episode, and just how do you go about reconciling the mistakes of that and the regret of that with also just, well, where did you get experience? Were you just too young to begin with? Was that necessary in order to there's a lot.
We'll save that for the dating episode, because I have some stuff. I have a lot of stuff to talk about that.
Okay, so then you mentioned at the beginning there that sense of being gay as being something terrible and wrong. Where did that come from? Was that purely media, or was that your parents? Because you still haven't come out to your parents, have you?
No, I have not. which is awful.
If you're listening
I know.
now.
Yeah, I guess so. So I've not officially come out to my parents. No, I've not sat them down and said, this is what's going on. There's two reasons. The one is the horrible thing, which is I'm scared too. I just really hate confrontation. So the idea of sitting them down, hey, so this thing is a thing that you should maybe know about.
Do you think they'd be surprised?
That's hard to say. I don't know. This is the non-communication of my family maybe talking, but I feel that my mom suspects but has not said anything. Is what I get from that. But I haven't pushed the issue too much. So number one is that I'm just scared too. Number two is that because I am bisexual, I can potentially hide it for a long time. Meaning that if I do end up having a long-lasting relationship with a woman, they never have to really come out to my parents. And so that there's kind of that into there as well.
See if that will work out for you.
I haven't come up to my parents. You had another question before that, didn't you?
Yeah. So just where did that idea of that being terrible come from?
I think media. I don't recall my parents ever really hating on gay people specifically. They definitely use those slurs a whole lot. My dad in particular.
Gay kind of thing?
No, I'd say stronger language than that, to things that he didn't like or hate. I also grew up in a time, specifically in the 90s, where saying things like "that's gay" was basically code for "that's bad."
Yeah.
So it was definitely media that really pushed that narrative that was bad. In a moment, though, I can talk to you about two instances of things that happened in the media, specifically that kind of was the opposite of that.
Okay, yeah. And when it comes to the other thing that just struck me as you were describing that is just how early The sexual. You talk about even dating in 7th grade, and that's just something that, I guess for me, I mean, I was a late bloomer to begin with, but then just the context, there wasn't the context for that.
Yeah,
so to hear it. Yeah.
I don't want to make it sound like I actually had I was dating girls, but
No.
I definitely kissed girls by the time I was in 7th grade. Yes.
But even just the fact that it took place in 3rd grade, that that and you said you had felt broken about that desire. Why was that? Was that because of media, or was it because of the guilt from your childhood?
I think there's a little bit of both. I think that there was already a part of me that felt incomplete and not exactly whole.
I think
that
that's
had nothing.
For all humans.
Potentially,
Spoiler.
that's probably we're all broken and we're all shells.
That's right.
I think it definitely was exacerbated by my realization that I was bisexual, but I think that it started way before that. Continually going back to the not feeling safe in my own home. I think that because that I didn't feel that I was already a little bit on rocky footing and rocky ground. And then when this realization hit me, it was kind of just another thing to add to the list.
Right. This is not normal.
This is not normal. I'm not normal. All these relationships are not normal, and therefore it's me that's causing it. I'm somehow responsible for all of this.
And would you say that coming out and being reconciled to that sexual identity has fixed that sense of brokenness?
In a case, I mean, I still have my bad days and bad mental health episodes.
Still steal cars?
Yeah, I still steal cars every day. I have to be gone in 60 seconds. I think to this day I still flash back to that every so often. Like I said, just because of bad mental health days. But I would say on the whole, it's nothing to do with my sexuality that I don't feel whole. It's more like failings or
right.
I don't know. Yeah, just being human.
Okay.
More
so
than
you've reconciled
else.
the fact that it's. I would say, put it this way: in 3rd grade, you thought that sexuality was part of your frustrations with your sexuality is part of what it meant to be broken.
Yes,
and
correct.
now you realize that there's other things that you're broken in, but the sexuality is not the cause of that. Okay.
That's right.
And was that just? How did that change? Why did that change in you? Was that just being exposed to healthier attitudes towards it in culture?
I think definitely representation played a whole lot of that. When you see people that are happy and healthy and are true to themselves, I think that definitely is helpful. And I think just being honest with myself too about what my needs were, about the reality of my sexuality, I think that definitely helped me just understand it a whole lot more. I mentioned they're making YouTube videos, and I know that sounds really pat and an easy answer, but I think just talking about it and not hiding it anymore was just it alleviated the pain a whole lot. And they talk about this in therapy sometimes, which I've gone to therapy too, which was a big benefit. Was that as soon as if you're holding on to something terrible has happened to you, or something that you're really anxious about, as soon as you tell somebody else, you're already breaking that into 50%, where it's like, okay, now they know and I know. And then if you tell like 2 or 3 people, now you're spreading it out amongst people at that point. At least psychologically you are, maybe not physically breaking it up into those many pieces, so that you don't have to feel like, oh, I'm the only one who has to suffer with this. I'm the only person who has to know about this. Now, as soon as you add other people into the equation, it's a lot easier to handle it, so that you don't have to feel like there's this huge rock that you're carrying on your back with you. So either just talking about it with one other person or your therapist or with a group of friends, I think that went a long way for me being a little bit more healthy.
But you're saying that it wasn't just telling your friends after that cult conference.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's
the
right.
art making that.
I think it was the art of making stuff too.
Yeah.
I think that what I really found, and this doesn't necessarily really have anything to do with my sexuality, is that I started becoming more of a creator in about that 2010 area. I let myself and allowed myself to make YouTube videos, yes, but also write a lot more. I started doing podcasting a couple of years later. I just started to be more creative with my time, and that just helped like expunge these things that are inside of myself in a creative way. And I think any artist will understand that, I think, a lot, where it's like sometimes you just need to get it out either through writing or get it out in your painting or photography or whatever it is that you like to do the most.
Yeah.
And it just makes you feel more centered and a lot less anxious. At least it does for me. So I think that becoming a creator and allowing myself to become a creator helped me out a whole lot.
Yeah, no, it was one of the themes I'd written down as we were talking, just the role that art had and creating itself had in restoring the humanity of being you.
Yeah, because I actually prevented myself from doing that basically my entire 20s. I just could convince myself so much that that's never going to happen, that I'm not an artist, so I should not try to make art in any conceivable way. And I think as soon as I started doing that a lot more, I became more of who I am today.
It's funny because that even as a Christian, that fits so well into my worldview, because I believe that we're made in the image of God, and God is a creator. Yeah. And so to become fully human is to create. And especially if you're a more creative type person, I think all humans, no matter what your vocation or what your sense of we all create in many ways. But it's something I about a year ago, I was quite frustrated at work and depressed. I just realized I could just switch my schedule around so that I have my evenings from say 10 to midnight free, and I can create, whether it's read, write, work on my website, work on the podcast during that time. And I felt much better about myself during that time. So just building those habits in made a huge difference in my life too. So yeah, it was encouraging hearing that.
Yeah.
When you talked about that grade 7 encounter with was it Stephen?
Yeah, I changed names, but yes.
Sure, it was Stephen. Did that I'm trying to remember, did that feel wrong what you were doing with him, or was that?
Yes.
Okay.
I won't hide the fact that I felt wrong doing it, but it also felt good at the same time. So there's this weird situation I found myself in, which is like, I don't want this to continue, but at the same time I do kind of want this to continue.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if I realized what I wanted my end goal to be with that. I just knew that it kind of felt good to have attention put onto me, which I know is basically how abusers get away with what they do a lot of the time, which is that sometimes the abused, it starts off by like, oh, this feels kind of good, and then they get taken advantage of. Yeah. And I think definitely that could have been where that ended up. In many ways, I feel that some of my encounters throughout my life could have been a whole lot worse, that I was somewhat spared like the worst case scenario in many areas. I mean, like there was the suicide, there was like my first real sexual experience, my first experience when I went to university. I mean, all of this stuff, you've seen the movies or TV shows and you see how sometimes how those all end up, and it didn't end up like that for me because of various different reasons. And I'm thankful for that for a way, but at the same time, I know that as a grade 7 student, I was like, I really want this to go further, and be like, I don't know how this is going to go further than this. Hi everyone, this is Kyle, somewhat rudely breaking into the conversation to let you know just a couple of things. First, Assumptions is brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. If you haven't gone to the Alberta Podcast Network's website, you really should. There are so many great shows to browse through. Shows like Don't Call Me a Guru, The Expats, Frank Reactions, High Level Showdown, and our newest show, Dave Berta. Check out all the great shows by going to albertapodcastnetwork.com. Secondly, we are helped by the ATB. If you're an artist, you know that banking can be difficult because your income isn't exactly traditional. ATB's new arts and culture branch was built for you. You can finally get your banking done in a way that works for you in the industry you work in. For more information, go to atb.com/thebranch. I do want to thank everyone for listening. We've been getting a great response from our listeners this season. Daniel and I really do truly appreciate it. I will once again ask that if you want to join into the conversation, you can send a voice recording of your thoughts about anything we've discussed to assumptionspod@gmail.com. Okay, let's get back to the episode.
It's interesting just thinking how you talked about that mutual desire for attention, and I'm in a healthy relationship right now, and one of, I guess, the first serious one that I've had, and one of the joys of it is just the sense that this other person cares about me, specifically me. This person likes me, and this person is fascinated by me, and I'm fascinated by her. And that's just, it is a wonderful feeling, and it is a very, I remember reading Wesley Hill's book as a celibate gay Christian. He says that not having that is one of the biggest frustrations, because it's something that we're made for. And it just, you're just talking about that example with Stephen and how that could lead to abuse, and yet at the same time, it done healthily and done in a good environment, it's one of the things that make relationships beautiful. But it can be distorted so quickly. It's just,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's true with a lot of different things, right? I mean, I think I was going to say the yin and yang, so we're going to bring in some Asian philosophy into this. I think everything has this like light side and dark side that you can find. Maybe it's Star Wars. I'll use a Star Wars example instead. There's this light side and dark side, I think, to everything, and I think that that's fascinating about human society and human culture and human behavior. But I think you have to know that it's like anything can be good, but it can also just be converted and corrupted into something really, really bad. And so you have to straddle that line sometimes and be like, is this healthy? Is what we're doing right now best for both of us? Or is this somehow being perverted or corrupted?
Well, the biblical worldview says that the dark side isn't a natural part of the universe that is necessary for it to function, but rather a distortion of the good, and something that is wrong and just isn't, that will be destroyed someday because it is bad.
Well, Darth Vader was destroyed, so that is absolutely 100% true. Sorry, spoiler alert for those who haven't seen a 35-year-old movie.
You mentioned a question that was asked of you?
Yes, the question that was asked of me. That was my friend Scott, that's his real name, who I surround myself with a lot of religious people. He is a religious scholar who teaches at a Bible college up in Sexsmith, Alberta.
I've seen him comment on my posts.
Yeah,
about the commentaries that I own.
I mean, I've told him about this. He doesn't really remember it, which is probably a good thing at the same time. But yeah, I bought everything. I'd written the note, and really, and his question is such a basic question, because all he said was, "We're gonna see you tomorrow, right?" Like as a question. And I was like, "Yes," and then I was stuck. I had to be like, "Well, I have to do this." And then having like slept that night and coming back the next day, I was like, I don't know if I really want to go through with what I had convinced myself I wanted to do yesterday. So this is definitely not like the tragic suicide stories of a lot of people, because it was like I was broken out of it by just a very simple question. And I struggled for a lot of years with suicidal thoughts off and on, but I never was as close to doing it as that moment in high school.
It's amazing hearing that, because we all have those incidences where there's people in our life that you don't know what's going on in their shadows, right? But you interact with them and you want them, and you ask a question like that seems just so simple. It's just a buddy, right?
Yeah.
And yet just hearing that can have an impact on someone is really encouraging, because there's people in my life that I know are struggling with those kind of areas, and you wonder what your impact is. And just the fact that Scott can't remember it too, it's almost better that way.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
it was so innocuous. It was such a nothing thing, but it meant so much to me at the time.
Yeah. Oh, I'm really happy that he said that. So coming back,
you would have had this different podcast in that alternate reality called Presumptions. Let me tell you about bisexuality. It's awful. Upload to iTunes.
I just remember way back in high school, my pastor just telling a story of how, like, what happens if you do get to heaven and you realize all the people that you've impacted that you didn't know you impacted. And that just really moved me at that moment, because I was thinking of kids in my life that I taught and worked with, and going, hey, I don't know what the impact of that is. And so it's encouraging to hear even just this side of things, to know that. Yeah, and just even thinking too of like how you have impacted my life, Kyle.
Oh man.
In many ways, and as a friend, but then also someone has changed how I approach people through these kind of discussions.
You do it with a big stick now. You poke them first.
It's actually just a cattle prod.
Yeah.
It's a very on purpose.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate that. I think that one of the biggest things, because I never had like that awful Christian story in my life. In fact, most of the Christians in my life were like the most helpful people in the world. So I definitely have a different outlook, I think, than most atheists do when it comes to religion in general.
Yeah, it's interesting that the thread runs through your life with our mutual friend Justin and Scott, and that's probably it.
That's it. Those are the only
just
Christians.
Those two, the university experience, I guess the regret, like your first encounters, did you have regret with those?
I definitely had regrets not trying to pursue it, yes. But I think going back to what I said before, for the homosexual relationships, I kind of regret not pursuing it further, just so I had more knowledge about that.
Right.
By the time I got older and
Right.
felt like I was just fumbling my way through things when I should have known what I was supposed to be doing. That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. What was it coming like that moment of coming out to your friends?
It was
that
scary because I don't really know. Like, I convinced myself so much that I knew exactly how everyone was going to react. That people were going to be not necessarily shocked, but people were going to be like, "Oh, that's the reality of what's going on," and then kind of slowly distance themselves from me.
Yeah.
I truly thought that was what was going to happen. That I would find myself completely alone in reality instead of just mentally alone with myself. And what it turned out was not that. Is that, okay, now we can just be truthful with one another. This is the reality of what's going on, and we can move on from there, type of thing. So I'm very thankful for the friends at that point, being able to be so welcoming of that reality.
You mentioned the role that Christians have had in that it's not been entirely negative. Have there been, though, negative responses to your sexuality?
Not overtly. I mean, I've gotten some hate comments on my YouTube videos a couple of times
that's my
about
alias,
that.
I'm sorry.
That's my alias. I mean, there's that, but I've never really had anyone in real life be overtly hostile to that. I've definitely dated people who had lots of questions and were a little bit unsure of how they wanted to proceed or if they wanted to proceed, but nothing overtly angry or mad.
Yeah, I've even felt it though with like my parents. It's something that's been like coming up, like, oh, should you be spending much time with him? Like, how are, not so much for me, but how will people perceive that? And like, what are the but you know, my dad follows the Mike Pence rule and has always taught the Mike Pence rule, so I'm not exactly surprised, but it's just interesting to see how, like, I felt it around you from people that are in my circles that I trust. Not that I have to say that they're the exception. Like, there's been, overall, people are really happy when they hear that.
By the way, we should just mention, if there is anyone who does not know what the Mike Pence rule is, it's you don't want to be alone with a woman that's not your wife.
That's right. Yeah. So and it's not so much that you're going to have an affair with this woman. I have a lot of feelings on this rule. I don't think it's wise. I think it assumes a lot of negative things about.
But still,
anyway. But it's more about the fact that what will people perceive is going on, and how will that damage your reputation.
My Mike Pence rule is never to be in a room with Mike Pence.
Oh, really?
So,
how's that working for you?
It's working great so far. In Canada, I don't really have to worry about it.
What about? So I guess one of the things that I think our listeners would appreciate that aren't familiar with bisexuality is you mentioned just now the conversation with your romantic partners about it. But I guess, how does that work ethically, or in terms of practically, or
I mean, here's
explain?
I think what we need to start off with is, how much do you know about Alfred Kinsey? Nothing. Okay. So Alfred Kinsey was this sex researcher back in the 50s or 60s, I want to say. He wrote an entire book on sexuality. Okay. Now, I believe there's some criticism going forward because of some of the research, of how he did some of the research. Was
always criticism on
not 100% ethical, I would say.
Okay.
But he went and interviewed tons of people on their sexual kinks, on who they were attracted to, their sexual partners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
Anyways,
when was this again?
His name was Alfred Kinsey.
What era? When?
I think it was 50s and 60s.
Okay, sure.
So kind of still buttoned up people and stuff like that. There's actually been a movie made about him that stars the guy from Taken, Liam Neeson, that you can go and watch. I don't think the movie's all that great, but let's understand like his thing. Why I bring this up is that the biggest takeaway from his research is this thing called the Kinsey scale. And it's the Kinsey scale of sexuality. Sure. So basically you rate yourself, or can find yourself on the scale, essentially from 1 to 5. I always forget which way that goes. But essentially, it's like 5 is completely heterosexual,
Right.
and 1 is completely homosexual.
Right. Makes sense.
And then there's variance within that,
Sure.
where you're predominantly heterosexual, but might have an attraction to the same sex once in your life, all the way up to being like, I'm completely homosexual. I've never had been attracted to the opposite sex ever in my life. I love that scale because I think that it means it kind of catalogs things really easily. Where I'm around the 3, I probably tend more towards the gay side a little bit, like veer over into that direction. But I still say
it's the V-neck t-shirts.
It's the V-neck t-shirts, yeah, that I wear. But I think I still hover around that 3 a lot, which means that, yes, I am attracted to both men and women. I'm not attracted to every man and woman, just like a heterosexual is not completely attracted to every single woman that they meet, or that a gay man or a gay woman is attracted to every same-sex person that they come across the street with. So there's definitely things like that. So how does it work in practice is that if I find someone attractive, and nowadays it is usually on the Tinder, we match up, and then we start discussing things just like a normal relationship would. And I do nowadays like to bring it up pretty quickly in like the first
like a
conversation.
Banner on your Tinder profile, like in Facebook, you have those like banner images that go across. Like
That's
a
right.
sports team.
Yeah.
Okay.
It says, "Hi, I'm bi."
Yeah. Hi and bi? No. Hi, I'm bi.
Yeah. You're high? No.
Oh, God.
Listen to what I'm saying.
Yeah.
No, but that's. So I try to bring it up pretty early in the conversation, just so that they know about that, and if they're not okay with it, that they don't feel like they wasted time, that sort of thing. But a relationship is a relationship, and I feel that I try and be as committed to the partners that I'm involved with in that time frame.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess the response that I have as a Christian is that idea of desire again, and that there is always going to be desires for things that ethically shouldn't happen.
Right.
And not to say, I mean, I don't necessarily believe that all humans ought to be a certain attraction, but in the sense that, just hearing about that scale, it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Because even if you're married to someone, you're going to be attracted to someone else, just as you are, or you may be someone who is committed in a relationship, but you do desire the other sex, but that doesn't mean you're going to necessarily act upon it.
Correct. I think that's the same way, though.
Right.
I mean, I know you're leading up to be like, maybe don't act on every single impulse, which I agree with as well.
But you still steal cars.
But I still steal cars,
okay.
yes.
There's that.
I think it's knowing that I am attracted to both, and then whoever I'm in a relationship with, I just have to treat them with respect and openness and honesty at the same time. I don't see it as being super different, other than the fact that I do pursue same-sex relationships at the same time.
Right. Whereas the Christian response, which we'll get into in the next episode,
only date women.
well, it's that there are very specific boundaries around sexual acts because they represent something much greater.
Yeah.
And that often is going to conflict with desire. And a whole part of the Christian life is...
Which is why, Daniel, this is going to be a funny thing that we were talking about off mic, which is why I want to convert to Judaism. I want to become Jewish. Well, you may have heard already, or definitely will hear in upcoming episodes, my conversation I had with Rabbi Seth, who lives down in Olympia, Washington. And we had a discussion about sexuality specifically as it relates to Judaism. And he says, like, honestly, there's nothing that's very specific about what is allowed, like, outside of marriage. It's like, I'll definitely counsel people that I think it should be in that way. But when it comes to, like, homosexuality or sex outside of marriage, it's like, I can't really point to you anything that says absolutely 100% never do this.
In the Torah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I'm just saying that the Jewish God is better than the Christian God, Daniel.
You don't usually hear it that way, but okay. I'm excited for that interview, though. I haven't listened to it yet. You just recorded it.
I probably completely butchered his stance, by the way. I want to be very clear that that's what I understood him to mean, but probably is not exactly what he meant 100%.
But yeah, we're looking forward to hearing the full interview, and I'm really glad he's on our show. And we will post the full interview as a bonus episode once we've wrapped up this season. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Kyle.
Before we end off here,
okay.
I know you were trying to wrap up, but I teased something that I think I should come back to, which is representation of gay people in culture.
Yes, you had mentioned something, and I was like, are we going to talk about this next season? Or
No. I'm going to talk about it now because I know this, again, these are very small things, but meant so much to me at the time. And if I rewatch it now, I actually tear up a little bit. But there's two instances, and this is also why I probably still have a fondness for like the sitcom as a format in America. There's two sitcoms in the 90s that dealt with homosexuality in a very upfront way. Number one was Roseanne, which I still adore that show so much for many different reasons. One, it was like the only show that actually showed poor people in what looked like an actual poor household, not like Hollywood poor, but actually like there was dirty clothes laying around and like you could tell that they were struggling. But they had so many different gay characters on that show in this like little tiny town. And while there was definitely jokes about it, it was never shown as being evil. In fact, it was shown in the exact opposite way. That's like, hey, no, they're people too. Let's treat them like people. And I thought that was really, really beneficial for me as a young kid.
So the fact that they're being treated as people. Right.
Not like this boogeyman in the corner.
Yeah.
Second one is probably the more obvious one that people will think of, which was the coming out of Ellen, which was a huge deal to me. Like
was that? What year was that?
Oh gosh, I'm going to say 96. Yeah. Somewhere around there. And just having her be so upfront about it, and I still remember the Oprah Winfrey episode where she came on and people were like yelling at her and calling her really bad names, and her and Oprah just sitting there trying to field like a conversation between things. I love the Oprah Winfrey Show, by the way. It was always on when I came home after school and I watched it all. It was great. But those were very important milestones that I think started to change the perception that gay people were there to like prey on children or even worse than that, and showed them like, no, we're just people. We just want to have relationships just like you. And so I just wanted to call that out specifically before I wrapped up.
That's a good way to wrap it up, because I think that's one of the things that we'll talk more about in the next episode. I think the Christians have done a terrible job which is treating people with those kinds of desires as less human, rather than saying, well, hang on, like according to your Bible, all of us are messed up and completely broken and have desires that range all over the place, and so many of us act on that. And so hearing your story and getting to know you as a person through this podcast, both as a friend but then also as our listeners, I think is excellent, and I'm really glad that you've been able to do that with us today.
Absolutely. So, Daniel, as we wrap up here, if people want to stay in contact with us, I think one of the better ways is that they can send like voicemails that they want to contribute to the conversation, or little messages to
if you have a story similar to Kyle's, we'd love to hear it. If you have any responses to Kyle's story, personal responses, we'd love to hear that too. And if you could, like you said, Kyle, record those just with the voice messages app, voice memos app. Or
you can, on your phone. There's many different ways that you can record yourself, but send them to assumptionspod@gmail.com. We'll definitely get it from there, and we can include that in our wrap-up show. You can also check us out either on Facebook or Twitter. We're at Assumptions Pod on both of those.
We're also on SoundCloud and Spotify and
all the different places.
The other thing too is we always include a lot of show notes, both on our website and on our on the podcast itself. So do take a look at that and follow the links.
Also, this is the first time we've mentioned it here in this second season, but so many of you actually took the time during our off period, in between seasons, to leave us reviews and comments on iTunes, which is great because it actually shows us a rating next to our into our podcast. So if you haven't done that yet, I definitely highly suggest you go and do it. We would definitely appreciate that. It bumps us up in the ratings and makes more people hear the show, which is
it also
great
boosts
for us.
Our self-esteem, which Kyle
needs. We need those internet points. Daniel, how can other people or the people that are listening to this stay in contact with you on the internet?
Find my website, danielmelvillejones.com. That's MELVILL. And for you, Kyle?
You can go to my website as well, which is thekylemarshall.com, or the even better way is twitter.com/thekylemarshall. That's Marshall with 2 L's.
That's right. All right, our next episode is going to be a big one, I feel. Brace yourselves. I know I am.
I know, it's going to be really fun.
Yeah.
Assumptions is produced by Kyle Marshall and Daniel Melville Jones. This episode edited by Kyle Marshall. Artwork by the always great Chris Taniguchi. Most of the music in this episode is from the band The Parson Redheads, but you can check out their music, that is the Parson Redheads music, anywhere digital music is available. Once again, huge thanks to all the contributors that you've been hearing in the past 2 episodes. Full credit will be given in a later podcast. Thanks for listening to the credits. We'll continue this conversation in a couple of weeks.